Hello, my name is Jérôme Segura. I'm Director of Threat Intelligence at Malwarebytes, and today I'm going to talk about hunting web skimmers with VirusTotal and YARA. In this talk, we'll look at web skimmers, we'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll check how the antivirus industry is detecting these web skimmers. And in particular, we'll look at the use case of using VirusTotal and then applying certain rules written in YARA to identify new web skimmers. And then I'll show what we're looking after, which is essentially identifying new infrastructure, identifying new victim sites, and doing so in an automated way. So first of all, a brief introduction about the threat landscape. It has evolved in the last few years, and in particular, if we look at client-side vulnerabilities, client-side drive-by exploits, they have almost disappeared. And this is principally due to the fact that Internet Explorer is almost no longer used. Its market share has severely declined in the last few years. So things like exploit kits, for example, are not as common as they used to be. And what we've noticed is threat actors have used different techniques. Rather than trying to infect machines directly via exploits, they'll try to use things like social engineering, for example. In the meantime, online shopping is at an all-time high. In particular, with the pandemic, we've seen people resort to doing more online shopping, and practically every brand out there has an online presence and a way for customers to order products or services via an online shopping cart. So this is an important aspect in what is going to affect the cybercrime interest as well in this. So server-side vulnerabilities, and in particular if we look at e-commerce, have really increased in the last few years. If we take the example of Magento, which is one of the more popular CMS for e-commerce, the number of CVEs was relatively low up until 2019, where it just exploded. And then we've seen things such as the Magento version 1 end of life, where a lot of sites were not able to migrate to the newer version, and that triggered massive exploitation via vulnerabilities. So that leads us to what we call digital skimming. There's actually various names for it: sniffers, digital skimmers, and perhaps the more popular name has been coined by RiskIQ, and it's Magecart. So we can think of these attacks kind of the digital equivalent of ATM skimming. And the name Magecart really and the work from RiskIQ brought this kind of attack into mainstream. It had been going on for a number of years, but it wasn't until some pretty major breaches that people worldwide started to pay attention to it, and we actually started noticing that there were a lot more attacks. So let's talk about web skimmers and how that works. So it starts from a store, an online store, that has been compromised. So there's various ways to compromise a store. We won't go into the details, but essentially that store is either loading malicious code externally or has malicious code that's embedded directly into its pages. A customer will visit the store, purchase products, and then arrive to the shopping cart where they finalize their payment and enter their credit card or other financial data to make the purchase. Normally, the flow would be the purchase would be made, and then there would be a check with the payment processor to make sure the credit card data is valid, and then that goes through. Eventually, the customer receives their products or services. With skimming, what happens is right at the purchase page, there is a piece of malicious code that's going to steal the customer's financial information. and send it to the criminal. And this happens completely transparently. The customer is none the wiser. And in fact, they may continue on with a purchase and not realize that their card just got skimmed. And so the criminals have essentially the full credit card number, the full name, address, all the details that they can use to then resell that credit card on the black market. And it's obviously, profitable, and that helps criminals to then develop new attacks, compromise more sites, and essentially just keep fueling this kind of cycle of compromising store, collecting credit cards. So here's an example of skimming code that was embedded directly into a website. This example shows code that's been obfuscated. That's one way of injecting code in the site. You can also simply call an external JavaScript library that also loads the code. So for those that track skimmers, this is something that we'll notice, but most customers, when they visit the site, they will not actually see that code. And that's why it's such a really potent attack. In fact, the customers, what they'll see oftentimes is a replica of the actual payment page. And that replica can be built using the code we saw earlier. So there's ways to inject forms that are placed on top of the regular payment form. And they look almost identical. In some cases, there may be some modified fields here and there, but for the most part, the idea is to match what the actual merchant site has and just place it above so that the customer makes their purchase, inputs their credit card information, and in that way, the criminals are able to collect all the data. So the skimmer actually kind of a transition, the more technical part here, but the skimmer on that page will make sure that, first of all, that we are at a checkout page, because as I've mentioned, the websites have been infected, but the malicious code for skimming will trigger when it's at the payment page only. It'll also make other checks, such as looking for things like debuggers, or other kind of presence of tools that may be assigned, that it's not an actual customer, but maybe a security researcher, in which case the code will not execute. But otherwise, if everything is good, the skimmer will monitor the payment form. It uses things like different intervals functions and can exfiltrate that data as it's typed, or once the customer presses the buy now button. But in any case, what's perhaps a misconception is people believe that they're on an HTTPS site, they think their data is secure. The irony is that the stolen data is going to be exfiltrated securely, but it's going to be exfiltrated in plain text. So again, part of why these attacks are effective and still quite misunderstood. Now, from the defender kind of side, with what we think probably at first would be how do antivirus detect skimmers? So antivirus, for the most part, will focus on traditional malware, but can also pick up skimmers. In particular, they'll look at code within JavaScript or HTML, and they have developed static signatures. So we see a number of AV products, if we use VirusTotal, that have detection for Magecart attacks. But there's still, just like in the regular malware field, there's no agreement on naming convention. So you really have to be doing some work to kind of enumerate, what an AV product would call a skimmer, whether they call it Magento stealer, card stealer, Magecart. It's kind of all over the place. And detection or lack of detection from AV products does not mean, especially on VirusTotal, does not mean actual protection in the wild. In fact, most products out there, especially when it comes to skimmers, have dynamic behavioral detection mechanisms. So not looking at a static file, but in the context of the user inputting data and data trying to be exfiltrated. So just a reminder that there's a lot of products out there that offer web protection, whether it's through browser extensions or just monitoring web traffic that can also protect from web skimmers. So that brings us to VirusTotal hunting. And just kind of a reminder that VirusTotal indexes different file formats, not just PE files. Obviously, PE files are what people are most used to and will upload to VirusTotal, but we see just about any kind of file format. Now, if you need to do more advanced work with VirusTotal, you're going to need a license. So, it's important to remember that for the remainder of the talk, that to access some of those advanced features, for example, live hunting, notifications, and all of that, you're going to need a premium license. And also remember that VirusTotal itself is not a crawler, but it has a pretty large data corpus, and that really helps to when you have a lot of people out there uploading files, you're going to find some interesting artifacts that you may or may not find from other ways. So here's a simple rule that we wrote that we're going to use for hunting within VirusTotal. So if you're familiar with VirusTotal, if you go into the hunting mode, you can start writing your own YARA rules and then have those rules pick up detections, whether it's on already uploaded samples, so that's called retro hunting, or things that are going to come in the future as they are being submitted by users. So this rule, which is kind of our standard starter rule, is interesting because it doesn't really require much work, in the sense that it leverages the AV products detections from VirusTotal. So you're going to get notifications every time someone uploads a file, HTML source code or JavaScript, that is being picked up by an antivirus product. So like I mentioned earlier, we're looking at things like the names by which antivirus products detect such things. So I've highlighted them in red: Magecart, skimmer, card stealer, Magento stealer. There might be a few more that are not in this list that some AV products use, but these are the most common that I found. So that's part of the actual metadata of the VirusTotal detection for an AV product. And we're limiting our search to certain types of files. In this case, we're limiting our search to scripts, and we're limiting also to HTML files. So we have scripts, HTML, and matching anything with one of those keywords. And as I said, very simple rule that's going to essentially leverage existing antivirus detections. And here's the results that we can see now. So the live hunt notifications. So using the rule that I just showed, we see a number of files that have been picked up. And you see actually the detection numbers, in some cases, is pretty high. Over 25 vendors detecting a particular file. So again, a good rule to start with, without really prerequisite knowledge of, what kind of patterns to look within JavaScript or HTML source code. Just, okay, let's show what an AV product might detect as a skimmer attack. Now, after this, you're going to want to, find your own, because the reality is a lot of AV products overall don't really detect skimmers, at least statically, that well. So you're going to want to, move beyond that static detection rules that they have, and create your own, and actually be more creative in the process. And that's really the power of writing YARA rules, where that's going to come from. So first of all, before you jump in, and you may wonder, how do I even begin with writing YARA rules on stuff that I may not be familiar with? There are a lot of open source data out there that you can start to look at. For example, you're like, okay, but what does a skimmer look like? I want to have actual examples of HTML and source code and JavaScript that I can look at patterns and then make up my own rules. So there's lots of resources. There's a good one with urlscan.io, which is a crawler. And if you look for the tag Magecart, you're going to find a lot of sites that have just been detected. Now you're still going to have to do a bit of hunting on, where in the crawl the actual malicious stuff is. But that's a really good resource. And of course, social media, Twitter in particular, hashtag Magecart. If you skip beyond the marketing stuff, there's a number of researchers that are publishing interesting research and examples, actual examples that they found, and they'll even show you the actual snippets of code that are the skimmer part. So essentially, you want to look at all of those and start kind of building your your own knowledge base, and that will really allow you to begin writing rules. So I just took an example from a tweet. The tweet showed me, okay, this is a new skimmer. This is what it looks like. In this case, I'm not sure if it was detected or not by an AV product, but regardless, we want to write our own rule. We don't want necessarily to depend on an AV detection. So I just took a few strings that were very particular to that skimmer, and then also, as usual, restrict my search to certain file types, scripts, and HTML. And that's it. A very basic rule. Again, you could make it a bit tighter depending on, if you want to limit false positives or not. But again, building a YARA rule that you're going to be able to put in your VirusTotal live hunt, and then be able to have notifications when that rule hits. So this is kind of this is the interface for the live hunt rule sets. So you can see I have a few rules in there already that are activated, and you see some of the rules already have 20 plus detections. So that's kind of the gist of it. You get these alerts, and then you have remember, you have the data about a file, right? Not necessarily a website, a file, which would be HTML or JavaScript that matched your rule. So some tips to get you started. We're looking for financial information. So look for things in, if you're doing searches based on strings, look for things like CVV, getCC info. These are the kind of things you want to look for in the source code. And remember also to use the base 64 equivalent. So, you'll find a lot of skimmers that are using obfuscation. And one common thing to do to hide the sensitive fields is to use base 64. One thing I like to do as well is to look for anti-debugging checks. So you may wonder why, but if you recall in the beginning, we talked about how a skimmer will check if the page you're at, when you're at the payment page, if you have the developer tools opened, which is a way to identify if it's a real customer or if it's a researcher. Well, we can use that against them and look for, within the source code, the presence of this check, which could be an indication that, the page you're on is looking for DevTools. Now, you're going to have a ton of false positive if you just do that in general, because a lot of sites that are not malicious, for some reason or another, will check if DevTools is open. So one thing I recommend is to also combine that particular string, DevTools open, with another string, which will include things like checkout, one page, which is the parts of the URL that indicate you are in, at the payment page. So essentially what it does is restrict your search to files that are interested in DevTools and checkout pages, which hopefully is e-commerce sites. And we've talked a lot about HTML and JavaScript files, but what we've seen also as a trend is for skimmers to be hidden within image files, so JPEG or PNG files. There's different techniques. Steganography is one of them, as well as putting JavaScript code within EXIF data. So you may want to craft a search that looks for image files that have, JavaScript in them, and you may be surprised by what you find. So now onto the interesting part. If you're a researcher, a defender, and you want to actually aggregate more information, what you're looking for is identifying new skimmer infrastructure, but also new victim sites. So like I said, when you get a hit in VirusTotal, you're going to get an actual file. So you're going to look at the file, you're going to, okay, that's cool, I have a file, but where does it come from? And unlike URScan.io, which is actually a crawl for a specific site, you have no idea where this file came from. It was submitted by a user, but we don't know. So that's where you're going to have to do a bit more exercise to identify the parts that we're looking for, which is the skimmer infrastructure, so skimming gates, and compromised victim sites as well. So that requires parsing the file content. And, you're going to find a lot of interesting things looking at those files. And it can be a way to detect skimmers. It can be a way to detect, victim sites, but also extract that information. And like I mentioned in the beginning, some victim sites load their skimmer remotely. So they'll make a call to a malicious domain that has JavaScript. And you can actually, use that as a rule as well to detect victim sites by having a list of known malicious skimmer loading points, and then easily identify victim sites that way. If you're interested in extracting skimmer gates, there's going to be a bit more work involved in the parsing of the file. So you're looking at the skimmer itself. If you're lucky, you're going to be able to extract that information as plain text, where some skimmers will say, will actually put the gate as, the string gate and then the name of the domain that they're exfiltrating the data to. So you can write a quick Python rule that will, look for this string and extract what's contained in between. Otherwise, that's, you're going to have to do a bit more work on, depending on the skimmer type, extracting that information from certain, from the code that's obfuscated and looking for some markers. So for example, you have obfuscation and then you're looking for HTTP. You're looking for a URL essentially within the obfuscated code. Now, extracting victim sites is a little easier, fortunately. So typically you'll have the HTML page, and HTML page is going to be the source page in a lot of cases for the homepage of the site, and you can find the name of the domain usually within that page. So things, if you're looking for the shortcut icon or any kind of marker and tags within the HTML page, you'll be able to extract the victim site. So that one is much easier than extracting gates because it's usually not obfuscated like a skimmer, and most sites will advertise what they are in their HTML source code. So this would be a really laborious process to do manually, because you're going to have lots of notifications, and doing that every time, either manually inspecting the file in a text editor or running a script per file is going to be pretty annoying. So what I'm showing is a script that I've written, and I've published the source code on GitHub, where you can essentially automate the parsing, and you're retrieving your VirusTotal live hunt notifications on the client side. So via the command line, you download the matches locally. You'll be able to display which URL matched and extract the skimming site and gate, again, depending on cases, not always, as well as store all of the information you have into a local database, which is really useful when it comes to VirusTotal, because as you'll notice, people, I don't know if it's the same people or not, but will tend to upload the same file over and over again. The problem is the hash will change. So they'll upload the same JavaScript or HTML, but it's a slightly different hash. So it's a new file and it's a new notification, but it's essentially the same site or the same skimmer. And you're not really interested in that. So a quick view from the command line. If you run the script, this is what it will output: the role name that matched, the match date, the SHA-256, the victim site. It will tell you if it's a new victim site or not. That's based on your local database. The skimmer gate, and it will also tell you whether it's a known gate or not. So we'll try to do that as much as possible, and it also outputs what it found and what it missed, which may help you to refine your code. And for example, if it missed victim sites, you're going to look at these files and think, okay, are these legit HTML files? Could I find the name of the site in them? And then you can refine your rules a little bit. This is the local database I was talking about. So MySQL database, and it indexes all of the information such that when you run the script, well, if you already have the SHA-256, it will just skip because it already knows it. Otherwise, it will process the file and then identify whether it already knows the gate or the victim site, so that you're not, bombarded with the same notifications all the time. The code is available on GitHub at this address. I've also uploaded some YARAs to get you started. And yeah, I'm always happy to hear feedback on this to improve the code and other ideas as well. All right, so in conclusions, we need tools, and Magecart attacks will continue to improve over time. So what I presented here with VirusTotal and YARA is really one use case. There's a lot of tools out there, in particular crawlers, where you can actually extend this work. So think of VirusTotal as your data repository, which you could replace with any other kind of data source you have. So if you have a crawler, you can use the same YARA rules on your crawler again to scan the files, HTML and JavaScript and so on, that your crawler has indexed. And really, it's a combination of open source intelligence, like I showed earlier. There's a lot of free resources out there. There's a lot of people that are publishing information that you can leverage to, better understand the threat and, eventually protect users. I also wanted to acknowledge many people without whom, this work would not be possible. I've learned a lot from them. The late Jonathan Klinsma, he's the one that brought Magecart into mainstream by identifying some of the biggest attacks we've seen. And then his work was continued by other people at RiskIQ, like Jordan Herman. So, these guys have done a ton of work on it. And people from social media like Twitter, Eric Brandel, known as Affable Kraut, he's done a lot of great work, and his tweets are very insightful as well. I love the way he breaks down, JavaScript code in particular. And also a big shout out to the folks at Segura, Dennis, Ben, Luke. They've been working on compromised sites directly, in particular all those e-commerce sites, and they have a really unique view of the threat. So they see server-side stuff, and their blogs are always very technical and very insightful as well. So that's it. Thank you very much.